Welcome to the Afrika für Almans podcast. In this episode, we will speak about the geopolitical relationship between the Russian Federation and the countries in the African continent. As you can hear, it's going to be taking place in English, and the reason is that I have a guest with me. I'm very honored to be joined today by the professor, Dr. Natalia Piskunova from Moscow State University. She has been before in the first season also a guest on the Afrika für Almans podcast and will give us some really insightful perspectives on the Russian history with regards to the relations to Africa, also in particular on the Soviet times, where a lot of, let's say, Second World countries could be found also in Africa and were supported by the communist revolution. And then thirdly, and more nuanced then, on the contemporary relationship between the Russian Federation and different countries in Africa. We touch also on the content of economic relations, specifically with regards to natural resources and weapon sales, and later also then reflect a bit on the soft power relationship between African students, for example, and others, and cultural institutes and the contemporary Russian civil society. So a lot of interesting topics. Check it out. There will be a second part of this conversation with a bit more of a, let's say, direct or private information on Professor Dr. Piskunova, where we will see also her way into African geopolitics. And lastly, I want to say thank you for a lot of feedback on the last episodes. I'm very enjoying all of you guys' attention, and thus I'm looking very forward to put them into practice. And this will be done, and there will be a time for that. But as you have seen in the feed of this podcast, we have reached 20 episodes already in the second season of Topics, and the continuation of that will be taking place in the autumn of this year, 2021, as there are a lot of private events going on in my life. Frederic, Julian, Tillmanns speaking, the end of my academic career, the new job, opportunities, new replacement outside of Germany, etc., etc. I don't want to bore you with details, but this summer I will take a few months now to recalibrate some energy and also some topics for the podcast, and then we will welcome each other back in the fall of this year. So guys, enjoy these episodes. Make sure also not to miss out on any of the past episodes, and I'm still going to be very open and happy to receive interactions with you guys, and make sure that these important issues and perspectives on Africa, the countries there, and also the connections to single players such as Germany in my case, or such as the Russian Federation in the case of Dr. Piskunova, are being heard and being presented, and therefore I think we have already come a very long way and will continue to do so in the near future. So enjoy this conversation, and I'm hearing you guys soon again. Have a good and relaxing summer. I welcome today the lecturer from Moscow State University, Dr. Natalia Piskunova, and together we would like to discuss a bit the geopolitical and historical connection between the Russian Federation and the African continent. And maybe just to get a bit started with this big topic, Dr. Piskunova, could you maybe start and tell us a bit on how the first connections with Russia, I'm not sure whether it's the Soviet times, whether it's the Tsarist times, how the first connections with the African continent came into being?
Of course. Thank you so much. So, hello. I would like to start with saying that not very much is known in Europe about how Russia actually started its journey in Africa. So, when we try to study the first Russian history and first encounters of Russia, it was the Russian kingdom. At that time, it was like pre-imperial times. We date back to the 11th century. So that's 11th century, when we had Prince Vladimir or Knyaz Vladimir of the pre-imperial Russia. And so he sent his first ambassadors to Egypt, or to this area that we know today as Egypt. And their task was to explore opportunities for a mutually beneficial relationship. That's what the ancient chronicles say. Of course, that was a mission largely linked to the Russian Orthodox Church. That was a Christian mission, and they were trying to widen their ties with the local Christians because they were Christians in Egypt as well, one of the ancient diasporas. Actually, even in 11th century, in Russian monasteries, it was also known that there was a story that Moses went through Egypt, and so they knew that this area existed. And they also knew about Sinai and the Sinai Orthodox Church that had actually very close ties with Jerusalem Patriarchy. And so Russian Patriarch wanted to establish more close relationship with all patriarchates that they knew. And so they went to the St. Catherine Monastery, and they also went to Alexandria, or to this area that we know as Alexandria. And then in the 12th century, in 14th century, 15th century, and so on, we had regular missions headed by monks. They were probably the first diplomats of Russia in Africa. So they were mostly religious missions, but they never actually had a task of converting anyone to, the Orthodox part of Christianity. They just wanted to establish political relations and to explore trade relations. So whether Russia would trade with Egypt and how Egypt would, trade with Russia and so on.
So interesting. The Christian, I guess the Christian aspect there, let's maybe exclude the converting part, but this sounds quite familiar with the story, I guess also the most European powers would consider in terms of Africa. But
and they were also Christians.
Yeah. I mean, of course, we're all from the Christian story there. But beyond that, I mean, things like the exploration of Africa started. Many ships also became involved in the slavery business. These kind of connections, did they also exist with regards to Russia?
They of course, they existed, and but the focus was mostly on trade relations, especially starting with the late 16th century and the early 17th century as well, when Russia actually established a system of credits to Egypt. So Egypt was in need of money, and the regent of Russia, Princess Sophia, or Tsarevna Sophia, actually said that they are establishing a full-fledged patronage over Sinai. So Sinai in 17th century was over Russian was under Russian patronage. So that included religious protection, military protection, preferential trade, and so on. So mostly the exploration was about trade. It was also about protection, because they were turbulent times as well.
True. But let's say the era then of slave trade and slowly accelerating colonial times in the 19th century, was that also a time where the Russian, I guess then Tsarist Empire became more involved, or were they not so much included in this European scramble for Africa?
The thing is that there is a crucial difference between what the European powers were doing in Africa and what Russia was doing at that time. So Russia was not really interested in the slave trade because we had a very different story with this back home. Russia was mostly interested in two things. First was trade, preferential certificates, as they were called, for Russian goods to be traded in Africa, whatever they could, especially in Egypt, in Morocco, in Libya, in Tunisia, so mostly the northern part of Africa. And the second thing was mostly military. So Russia wanted to explore the naval routes all across the Mediterranean, because it had their focus of military and political tension there, because it was at war with the Ottoman Empire for many years, and it wanted to safeguard its ships that were navigating in the Mediterranean closer to Turkey and Egypt. So it wanted to secure this area. So Russia did not actually go much into Africa geographically. So there were a few exploratory missions, definitely, but they were mostly ethnological, for example, in the middle of the 18th century and the end of the 18th century in Morocco and many other areas. But there was not any intention to actually control the territories or establish colonies. So that was not the focus. The focus was mostly on trade, as I said.
Okay, and so therefore I can conclude that also probably Russia was not involved in the Berlin Conference and these kind of, let's say, decisive events for the divide of Africa into colonial countries. Correct?
True. If we take back into history a little bit more, so the end of 18th century, 1781, 1791, the famous Russian Empress Catherine the Great, who was of German origin, she actually was one of the first Russian monarchs to sign a bilateral treaty of peace and friendship, how it was called, between Russia and Morocco. So that was one of the very, very famous papers signed at that time, and it actually showed to the European powers that Russia would like to be present, but has no territorial claims and has no territorial ambitions. So trade, yes, consular relations, absolutely, exploration, naval routes, establishing some secure ways for Russian ships to navigate the southern Mediterranean, yes, but they never actually had any clashes with European powers because the goals were very different, and they were a bit. So they were in Africa all the time, but they had a very different idea of what to do with Africa, and Africa was perceived as a transit area. So certain parts of Africa were as transit areas to the Middle East, to Turkey, to Iran, to Central Asia, with this southern route to Central Asia, and so on, and to India as well. But that probably explains why Russia never actually encountered any kind of colonial rules in Africa, I think.
Interesting. So it is quite the reverse German approach, because I guess for colonial ambitions in the German Empire, 1918, 1919 is the ending point. And I assume now, from what will probably come in the next minutes, that is more or less then the beginning point when the Russian, then Soviet empire starts to create some interest. Was it from the first point onwards on the agenda to build closer relations to Africa in 1919 already, or was it more of a slow process that came in the following years?
So so if we take this as the threshold of the century, so there were two things. The first thing came just very, very at the very end of the 19th century, when one of the Romanov brothers actually headed an expedition to Africa to establish 4 consular missions. So the idea was again to widen trade and consular relations and everything, but they were not finalized because of the revolution of the 1917, so all the missions went to a halt. And then 1919, 1920s plus, the new government of what was called the Soviet Republic of Russia, and then the Soviet Union in several years, they actually wanted to have a very different ideology. So they were more ideologically driven than the previous Russian Empire, or before that, the pre-imperial kingdoms of Russia. So there was no more focus on religion, because there was a focus on atheism in Soviet Union, but there was a new focus on ideology and what we today would have called a development aid. Well, of course, it was not called a development aid at that time. So they wanted to trade recognition for the new Soviet Republic, because there was a very, very sensitive period of time when the Soviet Republic was not recognized by many countries. So only few countries recognized it after 1919, the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty with the final stages of the First World War. And it was very eager to get international recognition. So what they did was probably an interesting maneuver. They offered money and development aid and everything, and the instructors and military aid to African countries and some Asian countries who were also experiencing some revolutionary periods. And they said, okay, we have what was called International. We have the Communist Party, and we have the common communist idea that would unite all of the world. We know all that story, but for providing all of this, we want the major thing to be done officially for us, which is please recognize us as a new country, they recognize our legacy and recognize our status and recognize our embassies. So the first embassies of the new country, the Soviet Union, were established in the very beginning of the 1920s. So there was a series of embassies established, and many ambassadors came back to Moscow, and some of them were new people, and some of them were actually studying in Moscow. So that was another story which began in 1920s and actually continues up to date, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the stream of African diplomats and politicians, even today, I guess we can see a few of them that did study in the Soviet times. But would you say then also that the end of the Second World War was more of a threshold, in the sense that the Soviet Union, now as a world power, also had the ambition to influence, let's say, many, I think back then called of the Third World, which was not yet divided, many revolutionary elements in Africa? Was that then more of a priority, or would you say that this was just a natural process of trying to get acceptance over?
Actually, as I studied diplomacy and history of diplomacy of Soviet Union, I think it was really a priority, because they wanted to have as many allies around the world as they could, because they were a new country on the map, and they had to reestablish all of the ties that were actually cut during the revolution, because lots of ambassadors fled to Europe, America, Asia, everywhere, and many embassies were closed. And so they had to offer a very, very interesting idea, and a very nice idea that African countries would be interested to sign up for. And that was the ideology of equality, and no focus on religion, and all these kind of things that they had. And they also explored this anti-colonialist philosophy, because that was something that they could counter the West with. So they said, okay, we have a different type of economy. We have the socialist type of economy, and equality, and there is like no businesses and no market, and everything is regulated by the state. But it was a very nice idea for African countries. So they actually liked the idea, and that's why they signed up for this. Yeah. So yes, I think it was a strategy, really.
And then, I mean, that's a very important point. I think the anti-colonial approach that was probably very attractive. So if we move now a bit forward to the end of most of the African colonial oppression from European powers, let's say the 1960s and so on, would you say then that also the amount of collaborations with the Soviet Union, or the amount of revolutionary movements in Africa, increased, and thereby also the influence, or was it already there before the independence came into place?
Well, it was growing. It was there, but it was growing for like 20 years and 30 years. And it was very important to wait for the new generation of leaders, of people to actually appear in those African countries. And I will just give one example. The leaders of the 1950s and 1960s, who actually then became presidents and prime ministers and heads of different African countries, actually went to the Soviet Union for free education. So they had their diplomas here. One of the most famous examples is one of the famous Egyptian presidents, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Well, I think he's a very famous one. And he was educated in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. So he received a professional military training at the academy named after Frunze. So he had a diploma here, and he spoke Russian, and he learned to how to fly a plane here. And so he was a pilot at that time. And And that's just one of the very brightest examples. Of course, lots of children who were actually raised here because it was safer to raise them here in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and other cities. And they got the education here. It was free, and they were safe. And then when the situations kind of stabilized back there in their countries, they went back home. And they got their higher posts. Of course, they had a very good, nostalgia of, how they studied here in Russia and all of the ties they had here and everything. So it was kind of natural for them to support what they had. So I would say that today we would have called this soft power approach, or smart power approach. So this export of education. So Soviet Union did did the reverse thing. It did not export its education. It imported actually the future leaders to educate them here in Moscow, and then send them back as ambassadors or new politicians. So it was I think it was an interesting thing to do, a good maneuver for the country, and that's what happened. The elite of 1950s and 1960s, then they took power in Africa. They were actually raised in the Soviet Union. And so they did not have to explore it from scratch. They knew who to talk with and how to do it and what to ask and what not to ask. So they actually learned the ways of how to deal with the Soviet administration and everything of this kind. So I think it was like an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. The soft power approach, I guess, was at that time extremely present. And I mean, it's important, just as a side note, that basically all of the leaders in those times came exclusively from European or in this case then also Soviet universities. And I guess this also explains some of the narratives that they would follow in the future. And nowadays we see, I unfortunately, I'm not saying it's better to study in Africa or not, but mostly military derivatives as leaders due to their way into power. And
I agree with you. Unfortunately, it was too much of a good thing. Yes, it was good for the future African leaders to receive military education here, but there were also other options. There was education in the agriculture. Lots of engineers were studying here, and lots of doctors were also studying. So they were studying different subjects, and they were actually and there still exists what is called a system of educational quotas. So it kind of came as a heritage of Soviet Union, and it was, as a legacy. It just went on to modern Russia. We still have, even at my university, we have a quota for each of the African countries that we have to receive, 15 students from Benin and 30 students from Egypt, and all this kind. So that's an interesting thing, really. Yeah.
Yeah. So talking of the different, let's say, approaches of soft power in this case, then I assume that also by this strategy there were some clashes with Western powers in Africa. Was there also any sort of conflict maybe resulting from African, let's say, clashes between those ideologies, or was it more of a global conflict, and then it would also be like a proxy in Africa, or was Africa also the cause of some bigger events?
Yeah, well, see, the thing is that if you read, when I read the old Soviet history books on Soviet-Africa relations and how it all happened, I would always come across the phrase that they were using, all those cliche phrases. Africa is a placdarm for Soviet American counteraction, something of this kind. So there were several areas where, they were never direct clashes, a front line or something, but they were supporting proxy states such as Ethiopia or Somalia, for example, Mozambique, and many other countries. Egypt, definitely Egypt, yes. Sudan, up to very very recent times, and many others. So the thing was that there were lots of Soviet military instructors present in most of the countries there, and there were lots of engineers. For example, in southern parts of Egypt with the Aswan Dam, they were actually helping to build it and to draw the plans for it, and that was happening in most of the countries. The thing is that there were countries of Maghreb, for example, and Western Africa, which traditionally had more, closer ties with France or Spain or Britain, well, mostly France, and they were kind of in between France and Soviet Union. So France also had kind of nice relationship with the Soviet Union. They were not very much opposed to what was going there. And so we had kind of silent agreement that Soviet Union would have its kind of share of economic ties with Maghreb, with the northern part. As for the Central Africa, it was mostly supporting the Soviet position. As for Eastern Africa, it was also mostly for the Soviet position, but for some parts of Egypt, because after Nasser was ousted and Anwar Sadat came to power, he actually supported the American position and so on. So that was happening in Mozambique, in Egypt, in Southern Africa, and so on. So what was happening there is that there were two poles of the Yalta-Potsdam system with the Cold War and everything. So the countries only had two options. So they had to choose the kind of a package deal. So if they go for a Soviet package deal, what they would get is a planned economy, the administration and the bureaucracy and everything of this kind. But they would get credits from the Soviet Union, then lots and lots of them, and military support, cultural support, education for free, like everything of this kind. The military bases, definitely. Preferential trade certificates, like low tax trades or no tax trade at all. So there were actually no tariffs in trade between Soviet Union and African countries because it wanted their support. Or they would go into what was called the American way, and they would support the free market economy and electoral cycle and everything of this kind. So it was very easy for African countries to choose. There were only two options. They did not have to design their own political path or their own political or their own economic path, like what to do. They were given like two sets, like two options. So either you go the Soviet way or you go the American way, and that was easy for them. So once they have chosen one set, they just went for it, and that was it. So I think it was also beneficial for African countries because they knew that they would have they actually knew that Soviet Union would never invade them because, it was mostly interested in exploring military bases, in gaining their political support when voting at the United Nations. That's very important.
Yeah, that's an important aspect too, right?
Because when you have like 50 plus votes, which in the General Assembly, which 100% will actually support any of your ideas there, you have a blocking package actually if we talk in corporate terms. Definitely. So that was Soviet Union what was doing. The Soviet diplomacy was very interesting to study at that time. So what they said, okay, we can veto something in the Security Council when we do not agree with something, or when we have the General Assembly discussing it, we have this third world supporting us, and it's like 70 plus votes, and that's a thing to be, to you have to cope with that somehow, and that's what that was the trick they played actually.
Yeah, that's it sounds like a very sound and complete coverage that then the Soviet ideology, more or less, I would say, offered to all these African young countries. But now it becomes, of course, even more interesting. How does that shift then when the slow decline, or let's say even the collapse of the Soviet Union takes place? Do these ties somehow survive, or do most of these connections, as you just mentioned it already in the Soviet Revolution back in the early 20th century, is it again a sort of reset for the connections between Russia and Africa?
Yes, you are right. That was a collapse, and that was a collapse not only of a country, but of the whole system of economic affairs. So what was called the Commonwealth, the Soviet Commonwealth for economic interaction was also lost, and the system was lost. Now we would call it kind of franchise. So certain parts of machinery were made in Africa and then brought to Soviet Union, vice versa. It was a big corporation in economic terms. Lots of ties, probably most of the ties were cut because with the national policy here that was called the policy of economic shock, with the transit to market economy, which was not gradual. It was one in a fortnight. The reforms, the structural things, the debts to the IMF that Russia experienced, and everything that Africa actually fell down in the list of priorities, unfortunately. So the top priority became the CIS, the Community of Commonwealth, the former Soviet republics, and Europe. So the idea of what we have to do in terms of foreign policy was mostly it presupposed what do we do with Europe and Central Asia and Eastern Europe, and that was it. So all of the ties were ruined, and that is why it is so hard to reestablish them and reinvent them, because the new generation of leaders came to power, or even several generations of leaders came into power, and 25 years later it's really hard, because all the countries who actually lost of the support of the Soviet Union, the financial support, military, cultural support, and everything, overnight they had to look for other partners, and they did, and that was quite logical for them, not to wait.
Yes.
And so they had a different story, and they established other partnerships, and they will not be breaking those partnerships, because when Russia says, okay, I'm back, and that is why it's very hard now to come back, and because now we have to offer a new idea. It's not the idea that existed in the imperial times. It's not the Soviet idea. It's something else. It's not like Chinese idea, when they have several areas of dominance, and they're mostly about economy. They do not go into political or structural things. So what does Russia offer to Africa? And that was the story of the last 10 years of reestablishing all the relations. Well, yes, by the beginning of 2000s, all the diplomatic ties were already reestablished, so all the embassies were working and everything, but the focus was on who would be the new partners? Would there be any priority? Would that be a priority on resources or trade or cultural interaction, or should Russia go into political things structural development and everything? And that was the main issue. So we're kind of back here, but we're not as strong in terms of ties as we used to be, but we can offer something else. And this is what we're working on right now, as I see it.
It's still in progress, you would say. This, let's say, more differentiated approach to Africa, instead of this wholesome package, as you called it before. Now they have to probably look for the details of this market, which is more or less nearly taken, I would say. From what I read, at least African leaders have a desk full of ambitious plans from world powers to make deals, and they can more or less choose now what is the most well suited to them. So it's a completely new market. But maybe just to give some individual cases, is there those still countries where you would say that this legacy of Russian connections has continued throughout the different periods, or would you say that the new partners now of Russia are more or less independently chosen?
I would say that there are 2 points here. The first is that, yes, we have a block of countries who have been our traditional partners even before Soviet Union. So that's also our partner number one in Africa is Egypt. So with Egypt, we established ties in 11th century, and with all the ups and downs, so we've been, trading and, talking to each other for more than 10 centuries now, 20 centuries, right? So Egypt was one of the first countries which actually reestablished relations with the post-Soviet Russia, and it still remains one of the key partners. And it also builds on the legacy because they knew that Aswan Dam was, and the old irrigation system was built mostly by the Soviet engineers, and many people received education in the Soviet Union, and Russia still is one of the top countries in terms of Egyptian tourist industry. I mean, before the coronavirus, definitely. So most of the tourists came from Russia. And the tourist industry of Egypt earns a lot from Russian tourists. Another partner would be Ethiopia. Definitely one of the traditional partners, so the Soviet Union, and before Soviet Union, the ancient Russia as well. So that will be the second partner. Some Northern African partners, such as Tunisia and Algeria, especially Algeria, mostly in terms of military cooperation, naval cooperation as well, and energy plants as well, especially with the new oil and gas exploration projects in the southern parts of Algeria. Russia is also there. Some of the old and new partners would include Central Africa and Chad, for example. As dubious as these stories might be with all the private military companies and everything, but there are also French companies and American companies there. Russia is also there for the uranium and for the technical diamonds, which are used for the lasers and everything. And so that's one of the partners that was, Central African Republic was not the top partner for Soviet Union, but it was one of those partners that existed, definitely. Going further to the southern part, it would be Mozambique and Angola, definitely. So Southern African Republic, probably not so much. It's rather a new partner, kind of, very gradual kind of development of relationship happened in the 1990s, and it goes on. We have a very good trade mission here, but Angola and Mozambique were kind of traditional partners for the Soviet Union, and they are still partners now. Especially Mozambique, definitely, with energy plants and everything. Yes,
I guess this also reflects the Kalashnikov and the Mozambique flag. So there's still at least the made in Russia.
Not a symbol we would like to that's always a shock.
At least an association, a symbol of association. I always remember there. But maybe then, just from a German perspective, to come to the substance of those relations, because of course in Germany or Europe as such, Russia is very famous for its substantive energy sector, and that's, I guess, also what makes most of the trade. Is that also the main source of economic tie then to these African countries that you named, or does the connection go into other areas as well?
Well, I would say that energy is one of the top priorities in bilateral trade with all of the African countries, but it's not number one, definitely. Okay. So it's not really number one. It's number one in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, with all this, the story about the Nord Stream and all of those gas scandals.
Stories out of this.
Oh yes, that's a long story. But for Africa, it's like one of the top three priorities, definitely. But not the first one, definitely. Military trade, yes, because Russia is one of the top suppliers of arms in the world, just like China and the USA and Britain as well. And African countries are very, eager to buy whichever arms they can take. They can find, be it Russian or French or American, like whatever. So military trade, yes. Energy trade and energy supplies and, the transit of Russian gas, yes, definitely, absolutely. Communication industry as well. So they're trying to set up joint communication companies, like, in Telefonia, in internet providing schemes and so on. One of the newer instruments of like Russian soft power in Africa and with African countries would be education. So as I mentioned earlier, there were educational quotas for African students to come to Soviet Union like many years ago, but then they were kind of lost in the 1990s, and now they are still being reestablished. Well, of course, there was a special university of people's friendship established here in Moscow. It still exists, and it's very famous. And well, actually, in a week or so, I will be reviewing a paper from a student from Benin who actually gets his PhD here, and it's so that's how I actually have this really at hand. This is happening still. And when I ask people, okay, why did you decide to do your PhD in Russia? I mean, you can go like wherever, you can go to any country, European country, Asian country. They said, well, it's kind of traditional, in our family or in our community. So when we hear about Russian education, it's like free, and they have good quotas, and their governments support that. So I think this is an interesting instrument of bilateral relationship. So this export of education, so it still exists. So I think this is how our Russian diplomacy, like the post-Soviet diplomacy, tries to build on its Soviet legacy. I think the educational export was a good thing at that time. But now it's not mostly military education as it was in 1950s and 1960s. It's mostly humanitarian. So it's social sciences. It's anything from literature to political science, economy, sociology, and all those subjects. Of course, many students come to study Russian language and everything, but many do come to study politics and diplomacy and all these non-military subjects, and that's. I think that's an interesting thing. I was really very surprised when I was asking African students here, like, why you can go and study economy in America, for example, or in China. Why? They said, well, we want to know the Russian ways because some things are very similar. I'm not sure if that's a good thing, but still.
Yeah, but maybe
but still, it works.
Yeah, maybe that's the benefit also of the more traditionalist approaches in many societies in Africa, that this still, maybe the current leadership doesn't remember this so much, but let's say family over generations still have this imprint.
Yeah, so there's a community memory of, we heard that, they have a good education and free as well. And one more thing I just forgot. There is, before coronavirus, definitely, there was a very ambitious project of Trans-Africa road system. And so Russian companies, the building companies, they had several trade agreements with at least 5 or 10 African countries to help them build this Trans-Sahara road, Transcontinental Africa road, and the rail system, and assist in that. So exporting our builders and our building projects for building roads, for constructing roads in Africa is also interesting idea, which is really very preferential. And that was one of the topics that was also discussed in Sochi a couple of years ago. So, trade, yes, but trade mostly. If we look at the exports, imports balance and the structure of what African countries sell to Russian market, that would be mostly agricultural. So, fruit and some raw materials as well. Some materials for construction also come from Africa, and Russia tries to export some machinery, which is kind of harder to do with European partners or with Asian partners, because the level of competition is too high for Russia there, and Russian machinery is very well sold in Africa, and that's that's a good story as well. So that's what we have now.
Yeah, and you mentioned already Sochi, so there's also let's say more institutionalized approach, and I guess also under the Lavrov foreign ministry, it has put more emphasis recently on Africa. And maybe where do you see also the unique selling point maybe of Russia in compared to if we say the big players? I guess nowadays everybody's talking about the Chinese influence and also their counterpart against, let's say, EU or American deals and partnerships. Where do you think Russia fits in there? Is there still some space from those former, let's say, more communist times, or is that mostly taken now by countries like China, or does Russia try to establish somehow a third position between those two?
Well, my opinion is that it's the latter. So Russia tries to kind of maneuver between all those big powers there, because it cannot offer what China offers. But on the other hand, China does not offer much in terms of political support. And that's what African countries expected from the Soviet Union. And that's what they expect from Russia as a country that actually inherited lots of contracts and lots of status things from the Soviet Union. So China doesn't do that. So it doesn't do structural reforms. It doesn't do development aid, just very little. It's mostly interested in taking the resources and just, taking them to China. And they mostly bring their top management and middle level management to Africa. And so Africans are only given the low-class jobs. And so this is I can't say that's a discriminatory policy, but, a bit really. European countries have a very different story and different pathway. And Russia tries to take the best practices it had from old Soviet times, but be more preferential, I would say, be more selective. So Soviet Union was mostly interested in taking as many countries into its sphere of influence as it could. The same was with America, for example, because that was how the system worked, right? You have to sign up more allies to to be stronger. So this is not the case now. However, I heard that many people said that we have a revival of the Cold War and everything. Well, I really much hope that we don't. What I would say that Russia does not go too much into politics of each and every country it trades with, but with a few exceptions, like of two or three countries. So when it tries to support the government and some other groups as well, usually it's and then it also has a turmoil like in Central African Republic.
Yeah, that is always that's
a very grim story, I would say, for all of the countries that are involved there. I would say that Russia tries to do more investment. It tries to trade quite selectively, and it also tries to build. So it does construction. That's what China doesn't do. China doesn't do construction. It does trade and extraction. So Russia tries to engage itself in construction projects, like in long-term construction projects there, and that's the difference, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was a very big overview on all the different aspects that the history and the present have covered. I have now a few more questions, of course, for the exclusive circle of the Afrika für Almans audience, but for this moment I thank you already, and then hope to hear from you at latest then at the next Sochi conference to discuss the implications of the future connection.
Of course, always, yes, I will be always happy to talk to you, of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.